actually able to do is ensure that that grid is stable and monetized efficiently at all times, which can bring increased tax revenue, it can bring increased jobs, and it never has to take away from the energy needs of the community.
I remember we had to deal with hit pieces over the last couple of months that everyone was trying to say Northern Data's revenue is basically going to get cut in half, right? Just because of the Bitcoin halving.
There's a really, really big difference in how miners work and how miners can work in conjunction with the grid and be helpful with the grid, which is not understood by mainstream media.
Well, hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Proof of Words podcast. I am, as always, your humble host, Patrick. And joining me back again is my co-host, Matt, who actually has been on hiatus for some time. I mean, Matt, you just had a baby, right?
I sure did.
Yeah. How's the father life treating you?
It's good. It's my second one, so it's not anything new to me, but I'm sleeping not at all instead of, barely sleeping with the first one. I got two of them keeping me up now. So
you should have just blown off doing this podcast and gone and taken a quick power nap.
No, I'm all lubed up right now on the caffeine.
Oh, perfect. Well, it's great to have you back, and it's wonderful to have you, Jamie, joining us today. For those of you that don't know, Jamie is the CEO of WonderPhi, former CEO of Hud 8, but maybe if you would be willing to give us a quick introduction, Jamie, that would be fantastic.
I'm not the CEO of WonderPhi. I'm a director on the.
Apologies.
Yes, definitely not the CEO. I'm on the board of directors of WonderPhi. I am the former CEO of Hud 8.
Oh, fantastic. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about what is it that you're actually up to now, then? I completely, apparently didn't do my homework as well as I should have.
Oh, that's all right. No, I joined the board of WonderPhi about, I think, 6 or 7 weeks ago. I wrapped up my time at Hud 8 in early February, and then took a couple months off to spend time with friends and family and travel, and then joined the WonderPhi board and started to do some other board work and advisory work, both mostly in and around the blockchain space.
Oh, wonderful. Are there any particular projects that you're involved with right now that you're very keenly excited about?
Actually, I'm just really excited about the space. I'm working on a lot of projects that are in stealth mode, which is super fun. Most of my career has been spent in public companies, so spending time right now with founders and startups that are in and around this space is a lot of fun and new for me. Obviously, being on the WonderPhi board has been there's been a lot of activity. I joined when we were in the middle of an activist attack, which has subsequently been resolved, and we had that voted through at the AGM a couple weeks ago. So it is nice to be part of a public company again, and in a space that I love so much.
Oh, that's fantastic. What particular verticals in the space? I mean, obviously you can't talk too much about the stealth projects that you're involved with. But I mean, are you working in the layer 2 space? Is it more DeFi? Is it the Bitcoin ecosystem? Where is it that your general thesis for building lies right now?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a Bitcoin maxi, but it is very close to my heart. So I'm always in and around that space. Also the AI space. I've been doing a lot in AI over the many years of my career. Just for those of you that don't know, before I was at Hud 8, the majority of my career was spent in data centers and in and around data centers, and then which ultimately evolved into AI. So that's a space that's super hot right now. There's lots of really, really fun projects happening there. So I spend my time a little bit between both of those worlds.
Oh, that's fantastic. So, I mean, I'm not a Bitcoin maximalist either. I mean, I actually ended up getting into crypto because I mean, I think kind of similar to you. I come from a little bit of a TradFi background. I mean, you were on the data center side of things. I came from TradFi. And what spoke to me was tokenization. So I remember when I was at the Deutsche Börse, we were keenly observing what was happening with the Ethereum ICO and what was happening around the Ethereum ecosystem in the early days. And it was so stupidly self-evident to me that everything would inevitably be tokenized. So I've always loved Ethereum, but being kind of the libertarian, I guess that I am, the Bitcoin ethos just spoke to me a little bit more. So it became for me a little bit more about Bitcoin. And I'm not someone that necessarily shuns any of the other layer one protocols. I mean, I don't get the meme coins for me. Like, okay, if you want to buy a collectible, go for it. I used to collect Pokemon cards when I was a kid. So that's kind of how I view the meme coins. So is what it is. But for me, it really, anything that I'm involved with right now is keenly tied around Bitcoin and the Bitcoin ecosystem. I mean, what has you most excited about what is being now developed in the Bitcoin ecosystem? Is it the because we now have the Bitcoin ETFs? Is it because you're seeing layer twos being built? And what really gets you excited about Bitcoin right now?
Yeah, I think what's been most exciting is seeing innovation come back to Bitcoin. I think for a long time the innovation was really happening on other blockchains. Ethereum obviously got a ton of attention. Solana continues to really come up in the space. But I think what happened when Ethereum went proof of stake, it really reminded people um, of the difference between proof of work and proof of stake. And proof of work,
Mm-hmm.
as we always say in the mining space, proof of work is a feature, not a bug. And there are a million reasons why it's critically important that Bitcoin is a proof of work blockchain. And we did see a lot of great innovations start coming back to the Bitcoin blockchain for people that really believe and want to build on a proof of work mechanism. And so obviously we saw a big spike in transaction fees, ordinals.
Mm-hmm.
Continue to see really good progress happening with the Lightning Network. I think that's the most exciting thing happening in Bitcoin is we're actually starting to see new projects, new development that ultimately is going to be to the long-term benefit of the Bitcoin ecosystem, including for the miners.
So I agree entirely. I mean, I remember. I mean, so we are. I mean, we as Samara Asset Group, we're invested in another publicly traded miner based out of here in Germany, Northern Data, right? And I remember we had to deal with hit pieces over the last couple of months that everyone was trying to say Northern Data's revenue is basically going to get cut in half, right? Just because of the Bitcoin halving. And I keep trying to explain to people, okay, yes, this halving's happening. I mean, worst is there's actually people out there that they see the Bitcoin halving and they go, oh, yeah, the Bitcoin price is getting cut in half. And there are actually people on like MSNBC believing that to be the case, right? I mean, so as a miner, and I believe you were CEO of Hud 8 through not this halving, but the prior halving for sure. What is it like to? Are there any changes operationally that you have to go through, or any new financial plannings that you have to endure preparing for life post halving?
Yeah, I mean the halving is kind of always built into how you think about capital deployment in the space. As you probably know, I was the first to really start to drive a diversification strategy as the CEO of Hut.
Mm-hmm.
We purchased the data center business from Terrago, which brought us 5 enterprise data centers, and really started looking at the AI space. And that was over 2 years ago. And now it's a very common trend for miners to be looking and investing and diversifying into AI. But really trying to think about how you manage cash flows and capital deployment given the intense cyclicality of Bitcoin, which again is pre-programmed into into the algorithm, that it's not something that you wait and think about the halving when it's 6 months out. It's something that you're constantly thinking about when you're thinking about business strategy and capital deployment. And really, I mean, you want to try to be as countercyclical as possible.
And that, I mean, I'm a very counter-cyclical investor. I mean, I look at some of the valuation. I mean, we obviously invest out of Samara Asset Group. We deploy not only to Bitcoin, but companies that build in and around the Bitcoin ecosystem. And largely we do that through funds, but we deployed more to funds and we deployed more to startups over the last 2 years. I could not imagine investing in startups today. I could not imagine investing in some of the tokens that are being issued today just because you're in that hype cycle. The valuations are so ungodly high. And you know what? Maybe you're going to make money. I don't know. But I would have rather invested over the last couple of years and use right now as the opportunity to really be liquidating certain assets, and not immediately right now, but 6 to 12 months down the road before the inevitable next crypto winter hits. I would rather be liquidating over that period of time, building up a cash stack, obviously putting it all in Bitcoin because I believe Bitcoin is the best treasury reserve asset, and then using the gains from those eventually to be deploying to new startups that are building in that ecosystem. So I mean, it's very interesting to hear that you have that exact same approach from a corporate financial management perspective. Now, you said something earlier, and I do want to touch on this, that proof of work is the feature, not the bug. That is not what the mainstream media will tell you. That is not what anybody outside of Bitcoin really will tell you. I would love it if you wouldn't mind fleshing that out a little bit. So why, in your mind, is proof of work the feature and not the bug that it's purported to be by some counterparties we have?
It all comes down to true decentralization. And I mean, what I think we have actually seen in the last year for the first time are some credible, objective, non-industry participants starting to talk about how important Bitcoin mining can be to the energy transition. KPMG wrote a great white paper that came out about 7 months ago, specifically on that topic and in support of what we're doing in this space. I think people don't understand en masse the difference between a Bitcoin mine, which by and large, Bitcoin miners use the power only intermittently. They don't use the power during peak demand, so they're really a flexible load. Whereas when we think about AI is a net taker on the grid. Those data centers have to be up 99.99% of the time, including during peak demand. So there's a really big difference in how miners work and how miners can work in conjunction with the grid and be helpful with the grid, which is not understood by mainstream media. And so we continue as an industry to have to do the heavy lifting of education. And it really is almost hand-to-hand combat right now to get people to truly understand the value that miners can bring, and how different they are from any other industrial scale data center type of workload.
And I think that's got to be one of the biggest challenges, right? Because you guys are the ones really on the front lines consuming the energy that's being used to mine Bitcoin. And of course, like the most like lowbrow attack on Bitcoin is, well, actually, it's just using more energy than most small countries, right? This is the attack that comes on Bitcoin constantly. So whenever you're meeting with prospective shareholders or you're having conversations with your regulators in Canada, what is it that you try to impart to them to show them why that argumentation doesn't really hold much water?
It's all about the flexibility of our relationship with the energy consumption. That's really what is not understood. But if you think about if a Bitcoin miner is working in conjunction with the community and the local energy provider, what they're actually able to do is ensure that grid is stable and monetized efficiently at all times, which can bring increased tax revenue, it can bring increased jobs, and it never has to take away from the energy needs of the community. So that's the most beautiful part of working of a miner working together with the key constituents. And no other industrial scale workload can do that. So I
So,
mean,
and I think this
it's
is a very,
complicated. That's the
yep.
challenge. But once people understand it, there's nothing more beautiful for the needs of a community than having a miner there to help balance things out and drive that incremental monetization, which otherwise wouldn't exist for that wasted energy, not outside of peak.
And I think you hit the nail on the head right there. And what I think most people don't understand, because let's be honest, the average layperson, they're not a electrical engineer, right? They don't know how grids work. Why is balancing the grid so important? Because naturally, I think people just assume, okay, we have a production facility, produces electricity. That electricity magically crosses a bunch of wires across the country to my house, and I flip on my light switch and I turn on my TV to watch Netflix, and voila, that grid or that production house transferred me energy. I get to use it. Why is that not actually the case? So maybe if you can elaborate a little bit on why balancing that grid is so important, that's maybe where people would understand.
Well, there is no magic involved. That's for sure. Um, and especially as we think about renewables, that's a great example. The wind doesn't blow 24 hours a day. The sun doesn't shine 24 hours a day. But that energy needs to be monetized when it's produced or as it's produced, because we do not have battery technology that allows for this the long-term saving of that energy to apply when the grid needs it. So really, you need somebody there that can consume whatever is produced when it is not otherwise being required by the grid. That's the critical
Mm-hmm.
that's the critical part.
So, because I mean, if you don't consume that energy, it effectively just dissipates. We basically consumed natural resources, ran it through the system, and poof, it's gone over time. I mean, it
That's
seems
it,
to me like
and if
that's a
you
bit.
don't use it is just wasted. And peak demand in general only occurs about 10% of the time. So your urban center will require kind of 100% of the available energy about 10% of the time, and the rest of the time, that energy, if it's not being consumed by somebody like a Bitcoin miner that doesn't need
Mhm.
100% energy to be fed to it, then otherwise it would be wasted for all of that non-peak demand, which is 90% of the time for
So
for
I was
that
having
base load and peak.
right. So I was having a conversation recently with an individual, and he had this idea about how that might be able to be used for a UBI. Now, whenever I hear UBI, my ears usually immediately shut off, just because as a concept, I pretty much hate it. I don't think the government should be giving away money for free, right? Inflation would run rampant. But this one was intriguing.
Would run rampant. You're
Well, it
suggesting it's
is
not
running
running
rampant, right?
rampant.
Well, even worse than what we have right now, right? But this was
Sure.
actually kind of intriguing to me, because my thought was, okay, fine. If you have public electric facilities that are manufacturing power, right? And during non-peak hours where they have excess capacity, you can actually just use the Bitcoin mining, and maybe it's not a private or publicly traded Bitcoin mining company, but maybe it's actually Bitcoin rigs set up and established by the local jurisdiction itself, right?
For sure.
Could that not be used, A, as a way to better balance their own grid, and B, offsetting tax income from locals? And for me, like, okay, it's not money that you're going to distribute, but you're going to be able to harvest assets and theoretically bring down taxation because you have a new revenue stream as a local government. That just makes so much sense to me. I don't understand why more local governments aren't trying to do stuff like that. I mean, is that a conversation you've ever really had with anybody?
Well, we've worked really closely with different municipalities over my tenure
Mm-hmm.
that completely understood it and get it, and like you'll eat that all across Texas. Um, in particular, they truly
Right.
understand the value and support miners accordingly. That's also true in Canada, in Alberta. Miners are really well supported. They work closely with the government. Uh, both municipal and provincial, and with the energy providers. That's exactly what we're seeing happening. The challenge is that it's that education piece. You've got to get to the right people. They have to take the time and be open minded to understand it. But once that light bulb goes on, it's really really powerful. But to my earlier point, it is hand to hand combat because um, this isn't an easy thing to understand. You really have to sit down in a room probably multiple times with multiple people across those stakeholder groups in order for everybody to kind
Mm-hmm.
of get on side and ultimately make it happen. But once they understand it, I mean, it is a beautiful synergistic relationship if done right.
Do you see the challenge there as being the capacity to learn it, or some people, I would say, at least from what I've seen in my circles, and Pat mentioned the layman earlier. That's me. I'm the layman. Nice to meet you. I don't know the
Nice to meet
first
you.
thing about a lot of this stuff, but it seems like I have the capacity and the will to learn a lot of it, and that's part of the reason why I'm on here to talk with Pat. I'm supposed to represent the average idiot, but to me, it would seem like there's a lot of barriers, at least would be in our Congress, with people that are not even willing to try to learn it and sort of look at this as like the boogeyman. How do you fight against that?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, that's the hardest part. If they're not willing to be open minded and learn, or worse yet, if they have a preconceived notion that they refuse to let go of, and you know, crypto is bad, and all those things we used to hear, and they've been disproven 1,000 times. But Bitcoin's for criminals, Bitcoin's for drug trafficking. Like, we've proven over and over and
Yeah.
over again that Bitcoin's the worst form of value to use to pay criminals because everything's on chain and traceable.
It's a 100% transparent public blockchain. You can't be worse. Like, okay, like Monero and stuff like that, I get, but like Bitcoin, no, you can't do that in Bitcoin.
No, you can't. But again, like, some people hold on to these old school notions, regardless of how many times we've disproved them, and they choose to believe that, and they choose not to open their minds to new conversations that would kind of break that prior mindset. If you've been screaming from the rooftops that Bitcoin's bad for 10 years, I think some people just don't want to then have to admit that maybe that wasn't the right position. They don't want to back off. They're entrenched almost.
So, I mean, yes, I do think a bit of it is ignorance. And I do think that because of that ignorance, people just have that preconceived notion and therefore they're just not going to be willing to accept Bitcoin. So it's stupidity out of ignorance. But I actually think that there is a little bit more of a malicious intent for certain parties. I mean, and I like,
Yes,
I don't
Bitcoin
know.
has enemies.
I like to think, right. Like I like to think of Hanlon's razor, right? Like it's not malintent unless it's proven, right? But I can't help but see malicious intent. I mean, Senator Warren is certainly one of those individuals that is just for whatever reason completely weaponized against Bitcoin because her largest constituents are the big banks, right? And I don't think that her arguments against Bitcoin have any element of honesty to them. I think she's doing this because she has a hidden agenda that she's being forced to push by her constituents, and that's where the malicious comes from. I mean, have you had to deal with people like that in your professional career?
Well, yeah, there are hidden agendas. Bitcoin's a big meaty um, topic that has there's unfortunately it has not we wanted it to be a bipartisan issue on both sides of the border. I'm based in Canada, but certainly the U.S. is where the dominant capital markets live, and it would be a lot better for it to have ultimately been bipartisan. But that's not the way it's gone. I
Nope.
did see Anthony Scaramucci tweeted out yesterday that there are 92 million crypto holders in the United States versus 62 million dog owners. I'm not sure where he got his stats, but if you think about just the weight of that and the significance of that voting block, I do find it really surprising that Warren continues to hold to that position, given just the sheer numbers involved of people that care about the space.
So I genuinely believe that. I mean, I'm not a Trump supporter by any stretch of the imagination. I've always voted for the Libertarian Party because I hate the idea of voting against something that you dislike. I've always felt that you should vote for what you believe in, what your values are, what your political alignment is, not against something. So even though as a libertarian, typically that means I guess I lean a little bit more right. This time around, because crypto has become a completely partisan topic, I find myself, I have to go vote for Donald Trump because he's flipped. And I think that it was Vivek Ramaswamy that kind of convinced Trump, like, okay, hey, you might personally not like Bitcoin. And I'm convinced Trump probably hates Bitcoin. But hey, Trump will do anything to get votes. And I'm pretty sure that he's only come out in support of Bitcoin and crypto because he knows that he's going to get votes out of it. Because this is something that, exactly as you said, I didn't even know there was 90 million Americans that hold Bitcoin. That number is astounding. I would have assumed it was something maybe around 30, 40, 50, you know?
We'll have to check.
But I mean,
we'll have to check the Mooch's source on that one. I'm literally just requoting Mooch's tweet.
I can't think that that's correct, right?
I have no idea. No idea if it's true or where he got it. But I do love the guy.
Well, I mean, there's only 180 million Americans. There's only 180 million adult Americans, roughly, right? And then the rest are kids or people under 18. That means half of American adults own crypto. That can't be true.
Couldn't tell you. No idea. But then Trump doubles down and comes out and now accepts campaign donations through the Bitcoin on the Lightning Network,
which is crazy. I mean, don't get me wrong. I absolutely love that he's doing it, and he's forced Biden to be a little softer on crypto. I mean, Biden just recently vetoed the bill, which was very, very unfortunate. But he's at least made it a political conversation. And maybe this should have been a political conversation significantly earlier, but now that conversation is happening mainstream. And it's going to be really interesting to see if Bitcoin becomes one of the key levers that ends up deciding the 2024 election. But I mean, from my view, it also seems to a certain extent that Bitcoin ended up kind of becoming a key piece of Canadian elections even earlier. Particularly around what happened with the trucker convoy. I mean, granted, you haven't had an election since, but I think that in particular really turned a lot of people off on Trudeau and his party.
Yeah, and Pierre's come out broadly in favor of the space. So I think, unfortunately, that's what drove a wedge in Canada around the issue. I would argue before that it was broadly bipartisan, but once the incident with the truckers happened and Pierre came out very publicly in support of Bitcoin and of the space, and then that kind of drove a wedge into it, and we haven't had an election. Pierre continues to poll very, very well. I think it'll be really interesting to see what happens when an election gets called, which honestly is unlikely for another year for us in Canada. So we are waiting quite a long time to go to the polls and have our opportunity to express our opinion about the incidents that happened a number of years ago now.
Well, I mean, you guys have, it's a 5 or a 6 year appointment when you win the election. I forget.
It's a little murky. 4 to 6
Okay.
is usually when it would get called. I can't remember exactly the number of months they can stretch it to. There's some sort of extension mechanism. I can't remember the details, but I
Fair
don't
enough.
think it can go past Q1 of 2026.
Okay. So, I mean, it's 18 months away, roughly, then,
Yeah,
at the absolute
I think
maximum.
the absolute outside is end of Q1 26.
So, it's going to be interesting to see, because if Bitcoin and crypto does become as real of the part of the political conversation as it seems like it is right now, and the reality is, I don't think that that's actually going to hold too much longer. I mean, with Trump's recent conviction and everything that's been happening around that, and God knows if Biden's actually going to end up being the candidate, it'll be a secondary piece of the conversation, but at least it's a part of the conversation. And it's going to be interesting to see what happens to other world leaders as they see this unfurl on the grand stage in America, and if that actually helps dictate their own policies. Because, like, for instance, over here in Europe, particularly in Germany, there has been a significant push against Bitcoin politically. The EU Commission, as well as the ECB, have taken the stance that Bitcoin has to go. And granted, on one hand, Europe is very interesting. On one hand, you have the political elites that are absolutely bashing Bitcoin, absolutely bashing crypto, saying it has no place in this modern society. But then on the other hand, they come up with the most comprehensive regulatory framework to make crypto more accessible in MiCA. I don't get it. It's absolutely baffling to me. On one hand, you have certain groups that are pushing this very hard, and I mean, I'm not the biggest fan of regulation, but at least they're getting stuff done. They're clarifying the rules, and as long as there's rules of the game, we know how to work in those channels, right? And we haven't seen that really. Yeah.
Well, we are blessed in Canada a bit from the regulatory framework perspective. I think in part because Ethereum was born here.
Yep.
Canadians kind of over-index in the space given our relatively small population. There are a lot of Canadians active and have been active a long time. Lots with thanks to Ethereum being born here in Toronto. But we've had Bitcoin spot ETFs trading in Canada for over 3 years. Ethereum spot, I think it's almost 2 years now. The Bitcoin
I
miners
mean, Canada
first,
had the first ETF.
yeah, first spot ETF. And this is where the miners went public in the beginning too. The first publicly traded Bitcoin miner was Hive, and the second was Hud 8. Both launched in Canada.
Yep.
Because we did have a regulatory and continue to have a regulatory environment that is constructive with respect to the space.
So what I find interesting about this, because like I know the 3IQ guys very well. I mean, a company that I used to be CEO of, Deutsche Digital Assets, we were one of the very first ETP providers over here in Europe, which it's not technically an ETF. It functions almost identically to an ETF. It's a debt instrument. It's the European version of that, right? So I remember when the 3IQ guys were pushing through their ETF. And what I love about Canadian regulation is that there is a burden of proof that the regulator has to have when it makes certain assertions as to why it's rejecting an ETF application or why it's rejecting an application for a listed security. And that's completely in contrast to the SEC. So the SEC held up the Bitcoin ETF for many, many, many years because there was a lack of custodianship. Okay, that's actually reasonable, right? And at that time, it was kind of provable that there wasn't any proper custodian. We didn't have SOC 1, SOC 2 compliant custodians back in 2015, 2016, right? But then the allegation was market manipulation. And this is initially what the Ontario regulator, in parallel to the SEC, was alleging why they can't bring a Bitcoin ETF forward. And I love what the 3IQ guys did. They basically turned around to the regulator and said, okay, prove it. You have to prove Bitcoin markets are manipulated. And they couldn't do it. So that was kind of the gotcha moment. And I love that you actually have that opportunity in Canada to have that conversation, that if a regulator is going to make an allegation, they have to prove it. That's completely the antithesis in the United States. The SEC doesn't have to prove anything. They're able to just go and say whatever they want without any burden of proof. And that's why it ended up getting held off for so long. I mean, there's a lot that America, I think, can learn about the Canadian regulatory environment.
Yeah, because it has been it's been quite straightforward. We haven't seen any blowups in Canada, unlike what we saw in the U.S. And I think a big reason for that is we had clear paths and regulation and the ability for folks to get licensed, which they did. I mean, WonderPhi has consolidated now 5 of the 11 platforms are within WonderPhi today, but very very clear regulatory environment for WonderPhi as a publicly traded company to trade to stake, and I think that's been a big advantage for us.
Oh, absolutely. So on the WonderFi topic, I mean, so you recently did not become the CEO. That's my
I,
fault.
I did. I just got on board.
You'll have to forgive me for that. You've become a
That's okay.
director of WonderFi. I mean, what was your
That's right.
inspiration there? Why was it that you identified with WonderFi, what they were doing, and decided that your next role would be in a directorship at WonderFi?
Yeah, I mean, they've put up 2 amazing quarters back to back. They went through a 3-way merger, which is obviously a huge lift. But they just consolidated the back end platforms for BitBuy and CoinSquare, which
Mm-hmm.
was announced a couple of weeks ago. So they've just done a really good job of operations and execution and bringing the platform together. And I think there's a huge opportunity in the space. They announced also recently their first international expansion with the purchase of a platform in Australia. So I think that's very synergistic. There's a lot of demographics in common between Canada and Australia. Australia is actually the leading developed nation from a crypto adoption perspective at 23%. We saw Australia's
Oh, wow.
spot. Yeah,
I didn't
their
know
spot
that.
ETF launched this. Yeah, their spot ETF launched this week.
Yep.
I think Thailand this week approved a spot ETF as well. And then even in Hong Kong, earlier this week, I think we saw they had 32 million in inflows for their ETF on one trading day. So I think that market is really ripe for growth, and I think WonderFi made the right move by putting a stake in the ground with that acquisition, and they're launching products into that space this quarter. So my belief is it's a really strong platform. They're making really smart decisions, and when they asked me to be part of it, I couldn't say no.
No, that's fantastic. I mean, really interesting to hear, especially that they're going abroad and they seemingly have a clear-cut strategy there. That's fantastic. So in the interest of time, because I know we're kind of running here close to the end, what has you absolutely most excited for WonderFi over the next year? What do your shareholders have to look for? Obviously, can't disclose too much, but what really should people be excited about for the next year? What's the big next milestones for WonderFi?
Yeah, I mean, I think the international growth is really exciting. I think the look, there's nothing there's nothing sexy about back end consolidation, but it absolutely has to be done. It's good for synergy. There are 1,000 good reasons to do it, but it's not sexy. But I think now we can focus on product enhancements and product development and growth, and really kind of come back to the stuff that's really fun and exciting now that for lack of a better term, the plumbing has been taken care of. And I think it's the right time in the market, really, to focus on the growth engine of the company.
Oh, that's fantastic. I'm going to be keeping a sharp eye on that, and I hope it all works out as well as it possibly can be for you guys.
Yeah, thank you so much. It is a really good team.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining us on the Proof of Words pod, Jamie. We're definitely going to try to have you back at some point in the future. I very much enjoyed this conversation. And as we go through this next Bitcoin cycle, I think we're probably going to have more to discuss shortly down the road.
Yeah, for sure. I'd love to come back, and I'm always up to something.
Fantastic. Thank you so much and have a great day.
My pleasure. You too. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.